Ken's always got some like weird sort of quip that he does, like, "Oh, welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that does this," and I'm like, I'm just not very funny, so I can just never think up anything like very good.
What a wonderful reminder of the strengths that we all bring to the body of Christ, and indeed the way that our weaknesses are covered by our brothers and sisters and siblings in Christ. So
some of us have more weaknesses covered by more strengths than others, you know.
Yeah, I'm going to find my strength one day, and it's going to be amazing when I do. So
maybe we both have the same strength, and it's just sort of being a mediocre white man. Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that just can't wait to welcome Comrade Starmer into number 10. Today I am not joined by our usual co-hosts, but I am joined by James Sholl. How are you doing, James?
I am great and very happy to be here.
I just thought we would make you feel a little bit more at home.
So the opening line to the Canadian national anthem is "O Canada, our home and native land."
Yeah, which feels like a slap in the face, doesn't it, for some people, right?
So people have started subverting it at a hockey game, you know, the most Canadian thing that could possibly happen, an ice hockey game for y'all across the pond over there. The singer changed it to "Our home on native land," which I think is
incredible.
Apt take.
Incredible. When I was trying to find like somewhere to download the Canadian national anthem, I found out that they did change the words legally a few years ago to make it more gender inclusive. So they're good at gradually shifting things to be slightly better to women. Maybe we'll just sort of ignore all of these First Nations people over here, you know.
Yeah, some of those women aren't Indigenous, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know, I need to check this out, and I can't remember exactly, but when we finally got full emancipation in Canada, and I can't remember when it was, but it was either the 60s or maybe the 70s that First Nations women were finally able to vote in Canadian elections. I'm like, that's not very long ago, guys. That's not a win.
It's not even that's within living memory, is it? That is like very recent. You know?
Yeah, like I was just at the church of a lady who had been voting in elections for quite a long time before that happened. Right?
Yeah.
The seniors in my church remember that.
So as people may be able to hear, James lives in Canada, but you're not from Canada, are you, James?
I am not from Canada. I am from Folkestone, the very southeast of England, where Adam also heralds from. I've been over here, how long now? 13 years. I came over on a bit of a dare because Tony Campolo told me to. And just kind of stuck around. And each time I plan on going back to England, something kind of intriguing pops up. And the church that I'm the pastor of, which is my title over here, are lovely and wonderful and very thoughtful. And it's Pride weekend in Toronto this weekend. And so later today, a few of us are going to the Trans March. Friday is the Trans March, which is so Pride. The big march on Sunday is not to be that guy, but like very commercial, like sponsored by like the bank.
Oh, surely not. Pride? No, going commercial.
Oh man, it is like, but like everything you think about rainbow capitalism, this is like the mecca of rainbow capitalism.
How many arms companies have you got sponsoring it?
All of them. No one's getting left out from this. But the Trans March, which is, still well attended because it's Toronto, which is a very kind of progressive city in theory, but they've kind of said, hey, we would love a bit more help and more people turning up and everything. So even though I don't, let me phrase this, I don't have any out trans people at the church. One of the deacons of our church, who is a member of the queer community, he said, I think it's a Trans March where we should really focus our efforts and focus our time. So, yep, that's where we've gone. And we recognize that trans people having a rough time, and especially over there on, do y'all know you're called Turf Island by the rest of the world? Is that a thing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you're aware.
I think we've sort of mentioned that on the podcast quite a few times at this point.
Well, I saw the other day that Keir Starmer said that he doesn't want to talk about trans identities in schools and is looking forward to meeting J.K. Rowling to talk about
Shocker,
it.
You know?
I'm like, well, that's cool. Like, I mean, yeah, let's meet like the head of the KKK and talk about black people whilst you're at it, right? Like, sure, they'll have a balanced and nuanced approach to this.
I mean, it's obviously like really sad kind of what's happened with J.K. Rowling over the last however many years, because you can sort of see in real time how she's been radicalized, right? Because, you know, she started off as someone who's like, I'm not transphobic, I have trans friends, to just being out and out really transphobic, really anti-trans, just nasty, nasty stuff. Yeah. And hanging out with the far right.
Yep. I kind of, when you say Christian leftist podcast, I'm like, I initially had it as Christian leftish. And I'm like, leftish? I need more left. It's not left enough.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of Christian leftish podcasts. Who needs another one, you know? we always joke that, you know, of course we have a podcast because we're two white millennial men, so like we have to have a podcast, you know, that's how it works.
Absolutely. And especially like post-COVID, that was really the kind of epicenter. Yeah. Like, we all just want to hear each other talk to one another. We
actually started our podcast prior to COVID, and it's sort of annoying. Yeah, like it's annoying that we've just ended up kind of being like our podcast feels a little bit like it started in COVID, but it didn't, damn it, it didn't.
You were before the market got saturated, and here we are.
Yeah. Much like how I used to make bread before COVID happened, then all the flour went off the shelves and I couldn't make my bloody bread anymore because of all these people going, oh, now I've got time. I might try my hand at making some bread. And my sourdough starter went bad because of those people. And do they still make bread? I bet your ass they don't.
I feel that in your desperation to not sound like a hipster, Adam, you may have fallen into the trap of, I was actually making bread and doing podcasts before it was cool, is not the flex that we think it is.
I think actually what's going on here is that you might just be being really classist. You know, some of us need to make bread. Because, you know,
if only I had the time to make sourdough, Adam. That's like...
Anyway, so yes, we are joined by James Sholl, pastor of Wellspring Worship Centre in Toronto.
Yep.
But first things first, I think we will start with a little bit of what else is on my mind grapes.
What else is on my mind grapes?
So, on my mind grapes today is a Canadian man who has made history, apparently, after receiving 0 votes in an election. So his name's Félix Antoine Hamel. I think that's how you say it.
Mm-hmm.
So there were 84 candidates, 84 people who stood. So it's not that surprising.
Yeah, there was a by-election in Toronto earlier this week,
Basically, Justin Trudeau had promised electoral reform back in 2015.
Yep.
And then, quietly kind of...
Got elected and then didn't deliver on his election promises.
Where have we seen that before?
It's a real shock to all of us that have never encountered a politician before.
I mean, particularly that kind of liberal centrist politician like Trudeau, like Starmer here and so on. But this guy was standing as a candidate to protest against that because he wants the electoral reform, and unfortunately he received 0 votes.
No amount of proportional representation is going to help you with that, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately not. However, he did sort of take it very well, I think, because he said, when I saw the result, I was like, well, I am the true unity candidate. Everyone agrees not to vote for me.
That's the kind of, exactly. That's the kind of attitude I like.
So there we go. James, have you got anything on your mind grapes?
Oh, I don't think about anything. I mean, I went to go and see a senior in my church just before this recording who is lovely, and she insisted on giving me fruit when I left. There weren't any grapes there, but she did insist on giving me a pear and an orange and a banana because old people are awesome. And sometimes that just happens. She's great, fiery Jamaican lady who has had a pretty tough life, but is also just amazing and hilarious and brilliant. Yeah. And some of the best stuff I do is just getting to hang out with people. So I've taken your mind grapes a little too literally, unfortunately, but that's what
No, well, I enjoy it. I think we'll consider the fruit that you got as honorary grapes for today, given that they are what's on your mind. For some reason, mind pears doesn't quite sound as good. So
maybe you're just used to hearing mind grapes. That's
it could be, yeah. I mean, to be honest, mind grapes is I think a 30 Rock reference that Ben put into the podcast, and I at this point quite deliberately have never seen 30 Rock. So all I know is that someone at some point says, what else is on my mind grapes or on your mind grapes? That's all I know about it. So I don't know what that actually means, but for us it means that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the journey that you and your church have been on in the last few years. Because you were hired by your church as their pastor, sort of with the understanding that you would start this path to full inclusion. Mm-hmm. We don't have the 2S in front of the LGBTQIA plus.
Sure.
Thing in this country. So maybe you should sort of just give people an idea. So for our UK listeners, which is most of the listeners, what that means. Yeah.
So the 2S, which we put before the LGBTQ2IA plus, depending on what we're working with, we use 2S LGBTQI plus, I think, right now. I used to say it when we were talking about this more. I got very good at people refer to the acronym, but because our church is a bit more chill about it now, you don't talk about it as much. The 2S refers to two-spirited, which refers to Indigenous queerness, basically. It's more nuanced than this, and I am not the right person to talk about it, but it's recognizing the kind of queerness in lots of different forms in First Nation spirituality, particularly. It's also important to recognize there are many, many, many First Nations indigenous to North America, or Turtle Island, as they refer to it as. So,
which is such a better name, by the way.
Oh yeah,
Turtle Island is such a rad name.
I'm all about Turtle Island, man. So yeah, that's why we put the 2S was actually moved in front just about 2 years ago or something. So I used to be very on top of these things. I'm still fairly on top of it, but that's why we kind of moved that there. To kind of acknowledge this, again, Indigenous people that have been mistreated in many, many, many ways by Canada. And of course, their queerness was naturally forgotten with that. So they tried to kind of elevate that. So that's why you have the 2S at the front.
You said that you went to Canada because Tony Campolo kind of did he dare you to, or what?
Almost, yeah. I was doing youth pastoring things at the church that both Adam and I went to. So Adam helped out quite a lot from time to time there. And then when my kind of contract came to an end, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I saw Tony Campolo, who has cared about social justice for a very long time and still does. One of the good ones, I think. I very much stan Tony Campolo. And I saw him talking at an event, and we got chatting afterwards because I kind of do that. And he asked me what I want to do, and I said I don't know. And he said, come and work for one of my organizations. And I said, okay. And after a few conversations, he said, all right, go to Canada, work with this organization. So I went there and had a good time. And then at the end of that year, I moved to intern with Wellspring, which is the church I'm now at. And I did a few years with them as a kind of ministry assistant, decided that I was kind of done with church work and that prison chaplaincy was the thing that most appealed to me. So I decided to get my degree so I could do prison chaplaincy more easily. Got my MDiv from Wycliffe College in Toronto, not the English one. So it's part of University of Toronto.
Goodness.
Yeah, I know. Tell me, there's only like 3 names. There's also a Tyndale here, but I went to Wycliffe.
Yeah.
During that process, I was actually going through the ordination process for the Church of England in England. So that was the plan. Get my degree, go into prisons in England, and the clerical collar, of course, gets you into prisons in England very easily. So
can I just say, if you will have seen this as well, I think. So where we grew up is not too far from Canterbury, which is, of course, where Canterbury Cathedral is, the mother church of the C of E, if you like. And you can stand outside the gates of the cathedral, because you have to pay to get in unless it's a service, right? But you can stand outside the gates of the cathedral and you could just watch people genuinely walk up to like the guards at the gate, pull down the top of their top to reveal their dog collar, and they're just waved through. So you could just I would recommend people just like wear a dog collar even if you're not ordained, and you'll get into everywhere for free. It's great.
So that appealed to me. I wanted to take the easiest route possible, obviously. And towards the end of my degree here, the pastor of Wellspring left, and they started looking for a new pastor, and they've always been, I'd say, a more certainly a very progressive evangelical church. And I realize those are two quite relative terms.
Yeah.
But I would say progressive, especially for North America, Canadian evangelicalism is far tamer than American evangelicalism. Not to say there aren't plenty of odious elements that I'm exposed to far more than I'd like. But it's not quite, that said, I think it's changing. Actually, I think it's getting far more culture warry up here than it was even when I was hired. So, for example, Wellspring had female elders before anyone else in the denomination did. They started a youth thing in the 60s before that was a thing that anyone was doing. So they've always been kind of on that edge, pushing people forward, pushing the denomination forward, which has usually been received with a bit of resistance, but eventually they kind of would give in and everyone was better for it. And so they were looking for a pastor. What they didn't realize, because they're so lovely, is that they didn't kind of realize how much the evangelical world had shifted in the previous few years. So this is in 2018 they were looking. And so they said, we're an evangelical church looking for an evangelical pastor. And so they went fishing from that pond, and they were a little bit disappointed with the fish that they were landing, shall we say. So, I mean, I don't think I'm supposed to know this, but I'm supposed to know some of it. One of the questions on the interviews was, someone in your church comes out, how do you respond? And one of the people that they really enjoyed talking to up until that point, unfortunately said, well, I tell them that they can't be here and they have to,
That's like, by the way, that's sort of shocking to hear, because obviously I don't know what it's like over there, but like over here, even the sort of, like, maybe not the most extreme, but like the fairly conservative evangelical churches will put on a show about how everyone is welcome.
Yeah.
Right? But when push comes to shove, ultimately what's happening there is they're not really being honest, because you're not actually welcome. But to hear someone, I mean, at least he's being upfront, right?
It was a she for what it's worth.
Sorry, yeah. I thought you said he. My bad.
I know, that's what's funny about it as well, because it's like, no, we're super progressive. Up until the point when it involves other people that are me. So yeah, but I think honestly, I think they were just being honest about it, because as you say, churches' websites will say everyone's welcome, but we all know that's not actually true. And so that's probably just a mask off moment, right? They're just saying, like, don't worry, we'll tell people they're welcome, but I'll make the tough call. Like, don't worry, if there is a gay, I will make sure they know that, like, and some of them, again, were a bit softer, but they said, well, I'd pray with them and everything. Anyway, they had these interviews and they weren't happy with these answers in particular. And I was on my way. I was a few months away from going back to England, and they asked me just to do a bit of pulpit supply as they were waiting. And I was given Jeremiah, the plans for you. That was the I have great plans for you. Yeah. And I just did. I'm not a particularly prophetic person, because I kind of like, I need validation too much. Like, prophets just kind of go for it, and then everyone hates them. They don't really care. I need to be liked too much to be a good prophet. So I kind of have the heart of a prophet, but the feelings of someone that can't cope with that. But I gave what I think was a reasonably prophetic message out of that. It's just like, this is what it means to love your city. Like within the context of the Jeremiah 29, that obviously we have at like weddings and everything. The context is very much love the city that doesn't love you, and good things will happen. Like that's the context. I mean, there is a context within the context, of course. And so I kind of just gave it to them and say, look, love these people that you haven't loved before, and it's going to be difficult. And when you're looking for that new pastor, you make sure they understand how important that is. And one of the elders at the church came up to me afterwards and said, would you consider applying? And I said no. And here we are, I guess. But even during the interview process, so interesting, because I got that question too. Like, someone in the church comes out, how do you respond? I'm like, I need a bit more context than this. Like, Are they a teenager? Are they married? Like, what's the deal? Because I will love it and I will include them and know how important they are to Jesus. But
you can't just assume that everyone's situation is the same, right?
Do they want to come out? Do they want to stay in the closet? Like, I will honor wherever they're at and walk with them and love them through it. But it's to say like, well, we should celebrate it from the front. Well, no, if they don't want to. So I think I bombed that interview, but I think I answered that question well enough that they had me back for another one. But I was really torn at the time
because you just love the Church of England so much. Is that what it was?
I just want to go to prisons, man. I just want to hang out with prisoners, and it keeps on not happening. And so, I was kind of enjoying that. I'm like, Leo, I've got a path. It's all good. I'm on the way. And they asked me to come back, and I really didn't feel like it. And so for my second interview, I basically said, look, here's the deal. You should not hire me, and this is why. And the primary reason is like, I am affirming this is something I will push for. And if you do it, the denomination will come for you and they will come for me, and it's going to be exhausting. So those are just non-negotiables for me. So if you want to hire me with that in mind, okay, maybe we can do it. And if not, that's okay. Again, legitimately, I was just like, it's absolutely fine. I'm not going to be affronted if you go, we're not here yet. But to their credit, they said, you know what, this is the way that we want to go. This is something that's important to us. This is what we're going to do. And so they before I was even hired, the denomination said, if you hire him, we're going to kick you out.
Whoa.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's nice to be hated by...
I know. I'm such an uninteresting person too. It's so funny.
So they were kicked out, right?
Yeah, well, we're not really sure.
Because you're listed on their website, I could tell you that much.
Are we still on there?
Wellspring is listed on the denomination...
Okay. So when I was hired, they basically suspended us. It was like an unofficial suspension for hiring me. And let's say the details aren't that exciting, but for the next few years, they kind of said, because initially you said, well, we think this is important conversation to have. And so, we don't want to make any rash decisions or anything. But so the long and short of it is that they really didn't want to have these conversations. Like I'd say a year or so ago, the denomination this is, they said, okay, we're going to have some conversations and listen to both sides. As much as I dislike that kind of parlance, and they had a very conservative guy leading the conversation. To his credit, I quite like him. Can't have everything. He was as balanced as a conservative member of the Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada was ever going to be. So he essentially gave a talk saying, this is what we think and this is what they think. Let's have a conversation. From this. And the denomination shut it down. They're like, no, it's too much. It's just too much. Like, we're not even going to entertain this. No. So like a conservative talk from a conservative guy, they were like, oh no, we can't do it. Like, this is how dug in they are, I think. Yeah. Which is really difficult. So they made us jump through a few hoops, which I did because my board are lovely and great, and they have eaten a lot of dirt for me. But there was a point where they said, well, maybe we can still ordain James. I'm like, look, you don't want to ordain me and I don't want you to ordain me, but sure, we'll jump through these hoops, because it kicked the can down the road for a couple of years at least and gave my board some breathing room. That was like the main thing. But all this time, of course, we're like preaching sermons saying, hey, full inclusion is beautiful. Let's read Romans 1 more carefully. Let's understand 1 Corinthians more carefully. What do these words mean? Why are we so fixated on this in the first place? Like, actually, there is more stuff to talk about. Like, this is only a big deal because y'all have made it a big deal. I was talking to a friend of mine. She is incredible. She is married to a woman as well. And she's just like, I'm just like a boring lesbian. Can we just like leave us alone and let us do our thing? She preached at Wellspring a few months ago, and she said, like, do you want me to give my coming out story? Like, is that important for you guys? Because I've talked to churches and lots of them say it's really important to us that we kind of hear your journey and hear your story and everything. And I'm able to say to her, just share whatever you think is interesting and important about you. And if that doesn't come up, don't bring it up. Like, I don't need you. Like, you just get to be your authentic self and you get to share that. So like, that's where we are now. It's beautiful that we can have queer people at the front who like can talk as much or as little about that. And I had another queer friend during our disability series who talked a lot about that because it was an important part of his journey and intersectionalities of disability and queerness, and did one of the best sermons I've ever heard on the healing of the beautiful gate. Absolutely amazing. So yeah, I did a bad job with the chronology there. But it's really interesting. At one point, they decided they weren't going to ordain me because I was universalist. And I'm like, you don't even know what universalism is to accuse me of it.
That's the one that I always find funniest, because unless you're like talking about specific forms, unless you're going to get really specific about it, like there's no argument. Like loads of the early church and the patristic, like the fathers, believed in forms of universalism. And the fact that people get so like wound up about that is sort of funny, given like how popular it was for like much of the church's history.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
Oh yeah, and they asked me about that too, and I'm just like, well, I mean, Scripture says that in the name of Jesus every knee will bow. Well, I believe they will. There you go. There's my theology. The Bible is like kind of explicitly universalist a lot of the time. So yeah, it's good enough for me.
I mean, this is sort of interesting because, like, particularly for an evangelical denomination, because I think now evangelicalism is like one of those words that really does just sort of mean whatever like the person who's using it wants it to mean a lot of the time, you know?
I like barely use it for the church anymore because it's not, I mean, I'll say like progressive evangelical because it makes people go, what does that mean? And I get to say, well, it means we have like full inclusion of our queer community. So it's that, but yeah, if I wouldn't tell anyone, we're Anabaptists originally. So the genesis of this super conservative evangelical denomination, it started about 140 years ago when a bunch of Anabaptists with their awesome peace-loving theology said, we are too closed off from the world. We need to be more involved in social justice. So they got together with a bunch of Wesleyans and were like, our theology is great. Like, our orthodoxy is amazing. Your orthopraxy is amazing. Let's get together and do this thing. And I'm like, sign me up all day for an Anabaptist cross method, like, Wesleyan denomination. Like,
that is a fun cross, isn't it?
Right? Like, why would you not want to? Like, so I'm very authentic to the denomination 130 years ago.
So how's the road to ordination looking at the moment?
With who? With them?
Well, I suppose with anyone, but yeah.
Oh, no. The Church of England, because once you're accepted, you have 3 years to kind of get a move on, and I didn't. So that has rotted. And with them, they bounced me a couple of years, or was it last year or 2 years ago? I forget. I mean, we all knew it was going to happen. It was kind of jumping through the hoops. But they said, we know I'm not going to shift on this. You're not going to shift on this. I had some good conversations. Again, I'm trying to I feel like I try to engage in good faith all those times because I try to do that. But we're just in such different places that, and we're seeing this more and more in Canada. I don't know about the church scene in England really, but in Canada it's very interesting. Like there is, North America last week, the United Reformed Church about a year ago, they basically said that same-sex marriages are very bad, and also we've also always said that. Like that's a thing you can do in the Reformed theology. Is like you can say that you've always said something even if you haven't always said it. So they did that, and last week they doubled down as well. So it's not only do we think it's really bad, but we're going to censure anyone, we're going to kick people out that agree with us, that disagree with us on it. So there is like a lot of it kicking around. There's the Free Methodists right now are trying to force this thing that ministers every year have to affirm their commitment to a quote traditional understanding of marriage. Of course,
really upholding that free in their title, aren't they?
Yeah, they're not great Methodists either. So, so even things like that. It's interesting that you're not. I think these things are like real red flags. Actually, that we don't have to affirm our commitment to the creeds every year. We don't have to affirm. Let alone our affirm our commitment to the Beatitudes or the Christ hymn in Philippians 2 or to Colossians. There are clear things that we could affirm our commitment to that shows that we are a Christocentric people, and instead the thing they're asking to affirm is their commitment to a quite traditional ideal of marriage. So you're actually saying that your interpretation of marriage is more important than your understanding of the divinity of Christ or the supremacy of God or the presence of the Holy Spirit which is like baffling to me. I think that's a bit that's really scary.
And of course, Jesus spoke about this stuff all the time, didn't he?
I know. I'm sure we've said this lots of times, but I feel if it was that important, Jesus might have mentioned it once or twice. And let's affirm our commitment to Matthew 25 and our commitment to feeding people who are hungry and giving clothes to those who are naked. There are so many things that we could be affirming our commitments to, and instead it's this. It's this bizarre culture war, which you will die on this hill. And I know you think that's martyrdom, but actually it's not. Like anyone under 30 is just embarrassed by you. You are now the racist granddad at Christmas. Like that's who you are. This is how your children are going to see you, how your grandchildren are going to see you. That this is the hill you chose to die on. And so, there's always the danger of sounding smug in these spaces, which isn't what I want to do, because ultimately I always want to compel people with beauty. And I think that's something we are able to do as a church that fully accepts and loves people. You can see the beauty of it. You can, especially we've seen, the last time I preached on this was probably a couple of years ago. I preached about the fruit of our homophobia and the fruit of inclusion. And if we keep on seeing fruit of alienation and ostracization and suicidation and self-harm, then we would know the seed and the plant is bad. So we should stop planting those trees and thinking we're going to get different fruit. And we know what fruit we can get from these other trees. So, and at the end of that, I just said, so we're kind of done here. I'm not going to preach on this again. And there's no both sides here. I'm not going to have someone preach about why women can't lead. I'm not going to have someone preach about why other races are inferior. So why would I have someone? I know the fruit because I know the fruit of prejudice. I know the fruit of racism. I know the fruit of sexism. I know the fruit of homophobia. So we're not going to have that. There's no room for it.
I always sort of bring it back to how I think a lot of mainstream Christianity has essentially become a social club. Like if you agree with the rules, you're in the club, and the rules are essentially uphold the existing social order and don't really question anything. And maybe we will very, very occasionally eventually be dragged kicking and screaming along with the rest of the world when they decide to change something. But we're never, I think what's frustrating about it is that it lacks anything resembling a prophetic voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think we end up in this place where what churches are claiming is prophetic is, well, apart from me, it's boring. It's really
Yeah.
boring. And what we should be doing is actually challenging systems and structures of power that actively make life more difficult for people for being who they are, for being something that God has made them to be, you know, if you want to put it in those terms. I think part of the reason I wanted to get you on as well is that I've heard you talk on this like quite a few times at this point, right? And yeah, as you said, you want to do that in a way that is trying to bring people along, is trying to show the beauty and the love in all this stuff. And I think like on our podcast, we've sort of given up on that a little bit, which is probably an indictment on us. We're just pretty cynical at this point, you know.
That's easy. No, and it's easy to do. And again, bear in mind, this is me public facing, and this isn't me despairing. But yeah, we can be honest. I lost a bunch of people. We lost a lot of money. Friends of mine who have a church that decided to go affirming about a year and a half ago. I want to say there were about 500 people. They lost 200 people.
Wow.
Pretty much overnight. I listened to their kind of discernment process, and they spent years like reading and researching and seeing where they landed, and all the elders landed in the same place and all the leaders landed in the same place. Our thing was like, we'll hire James and he'll bimble along and we'll kind of work it out, which kind of has, like, say, but there are moments of hardship. And I think to say like affirm it again, all these words kind of only mean as watchers as we kind of give them to. So we talk about full participation. So your gender, race, sexuality, ability, any of these things, none of these things will stop you from being in any role that is in line with your gifting ultimately. Yeah. And we're better for that. And we celebrate that.
Yeah.
So, but the different kind of levels of affirming churches. So some churches will make this incredibly central to their identity. They will have rainbow flags everywhere. We just don't have flags. I'm just not a flag kind of guy. He says to the dude with 1 billion flags in the background.
Yeah, except, I mean, I don't have any national flags.
I would say your flags are pretty subversive. Yeah, there's an anti-fascist one, a Christians for Palestine, and a pride flag.
This is not a flag. This is a placard.
Oh, very good. Okay, sorry. Yeah. I do apologize. Even better then. So, and we'll make that kind of very central and very, and that's good. I'm glad those places exist. I want those places to exist. I want people to have those spaces. They want it. But at least the queer people that have joined our community have said, hey, I love that I'm able, and they do preach and they are on our board and everything, which is great. But they also kind of want to talk about other things. Like ironically, my friend who is on the deacons board, he went to a very affirming church and he just felt like the theology wasn't quite like rich enough for him because there was so much focus on that identity. And again, I'm glad those places exist and I'm glad people have that space. Yeah, it's interesting too, because there's still a number of people at the church who are not affirming, who aren't there. Like, again, everything's a scale, right? So me being a full 10, which I am, and then I recognize there's a lot of people that are 9s and 8s, and there's a couple that actually were 0s and now they're 2s. And that's like, they've come a really long way, actually. I think I talked about the parable of the prodigal son, which, you know, is the parable of the loving father and his 2 lost sons, if we're honest about what this thing's about. And I think about the end of that story where the older son stands outside and, well, we don't know if he goes into the party. All we know is that the son says, look, everything I have is yours and I love you, but we got to celebrate because the people that weren't here, they're here now. The son that wasn't here, he's here now. So we celebrate. And the people that have stayed in my community, I think they're that older brother that said, I don't even necessarily agree with this, but I'm going to go into the party. Like, I'm going to go, I'm going to celebrate because there is still something to celebrate here. Yeah. And so I really say it's difficult, and it's still, obviously it's very sad to me, and I want everyone to agree with me because I think I'm right about everything. Of course I do. But actually, they have come further in 5 years than I have in 40. Yeah. So I think it's really important to honor those spaces as well. But it's also important to realize that their presence may mean that some people don't feel entirely safe. And we want to honor that too and say, but I can recommend these spaces for you. At the same time, there's also people that go, I don't want any of this affirming stuff. I'm like, that's great. There's like 10 churches within 10 minutes that you can go to. You'll fit right in. Don't worry about it. And I mean, I always grieve that, and I'm being very flippant there. And I say, actually, I think you can stay and disagree. And we probably disagree about a bunch of stuff, right? Like everyone in the pew has a slightly different way of doing things. And obviously my way of leadership is trying to make space for those voices and everything, so long as they're not harmful. So we ask a lot of our congregation, actually. Like we do ask them to hold that space and recognize that. And I also recognize that's really costly to like our queer siblings, that they ultimately, that is putting a lot on them. And that's something I try to acknowledge as well. And for the most part, the folks that have stayed, they're like, yeah, absolutely, I recognize it and this is worth it. And I want to be part and want to be in those relationships. So
yeah, I mean, that was going to be my question, actually, was about how you navigate that kind of thing in terms of like keeping people safe. And there's an element of it where the gospel isn't safe on some level. And also like in church, you're going to have people who, you know, don't agree with you on everything. But I also think there's a difference between the ways in which we might say that the gospel isn't always safe.
Yeah, of course.
And the ways in which it's not safe to be an out LGBTQ plus person in a room, you know?
Yeah, quite. I mean, the safer you are in your life, the less safe the gospel should be for you. I think that's kind of how, so absolutely, yeah, the gospel isn't safe, but it's especially, the more you have, the more dangerous it is.
Yeah.
The more privilege, the more power, the more resources, all those things. Like, I think that's who the gospel isn't safe for.
That's the fascinating thing, isn't it? Is that like Jesus never talks about sexuality or anything like that. And you know, we can go on about why that is. I think people have done that over and over again. But what Jesus does talk about a lot, and what the Bible does talk about a lot, way more than it ever talks about that stuff, is money. Is rich people, is where rich people might end up if they carry on being rich. Notwithstanding the fact that you and I are both universalists, but sometimes I think the rhetoric of you know, sending rich people to hell can be a fun one. You know,
I mean, you know, take those things literally that say nothing about belief in Jesus and everything about treatment of the poor. Like treat those verses literally. Have fun with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just a real importance in kind of staying humble. And I think this is it, that we want to stay humble in our interpretations. I think one of the things that was really helpful for me was that 5 years ago, or longer than that, when I was doing my seminary degree, it was reading accounts of slave-owning Christians just before the Civil War in America. And there's some monsters out there. Of course there are. And I'm not, I want to be clear, not pro-slavery. So get that as a soundbite. Please don't edit that out.
That's quite a radical position to take, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. I'm really
not sure you'll live that one down.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I know.
It's what your denomination does about that, hey?
Honestly, they probably... Never mind. Well, but this is the thing, right? Hey, the Bible says an awful lot about slavery. And there is a lot of compelling argument from Scripture about why slavery is, you know, why God wants slavery. If we have an unnuanced reading of these things, and if we have a reading from the center of power rather than from the margins, ultimately that's where we're going to come from. You know, there's a reason why Exodus was banned from most slave Bibles, because we didn't want them getting ideas, do we? So I think, and that's also everyone's like common story of, especially African American Christianity. That is like their shared story. But what kind of compelled me and intrigued me was these diaries of essentially slave-owning Christians who said, I don't feel right about this. Like, I feel this is wrong to own another human, but the Bible says I should. My pastor says I should. So I must be wrong. Like, I just have to be wrong about this. Yeah. And even though like this thing is pulling on my spirit and I know inherently there is something evil about this, I have kind of submitted my authority submitted to these authorities or these interpretations of authorities. And I think it's really helpful. And you know, we can say, well, they shouldn't have abdicated and maybe they shouldn't have, and maybe they should have followed their conscience and all those things. But ultimately, there were some really, I think, good, thoughtful people that wanted to do the godly thing, and they were told the godly thing was this thing we now recognize as a terrible evil. And I think this is the same thing that's happening now. I think there's so many people that want to believe that this is okay, but have been told, again, frustratingly, that this is now the kind of acid test for Christianity. It's not where so very early when I started at the church, guy that had been there a while, and he said to me again, I want to welcome people, but I'm really nervous about them being around the children, which is, again, it's a horrendous position to have, but it's a very common one. So we want to honor, we want to be realistic. This is what a lot of people are thinking, sadly. And he said, I'm just worried about that. Well, what do we do if they want to help look after the Sunday school? And my response always is, what do I do if a rich person wants to?
Yeah.
Because there is so much in scripture that tells me about the dangers of money, the dangers of the love of money, all of these things. So how do we honor that? And the problem is we celebrate the rich and the businessmen, and they are the people we want on our boards and everything. And to his credit, he still says, yeah, that was the conversation that made me understand how kind of shuttered I'd been. And I'm saying him a lot, but the queer deacon from my church had a big party a couple of weeks ago, and that guy was there.
Yeah.
And so, like, to see, and hey, it's 5 years of relationship, and I want to be clear, it's still my friend who has done the heavy lifting there of absorbing the bullshit and absorbing the blows and listening to, people say, hey, I want to be your friend, but I'm a bit nervous, or like, I love you, I just don't agree with you, like this thing. And I don't think people know how much that costs him to essentially have your identity kind of ripped every time. But he has been strong enough and generous enough to stay in those relationships. And then we get to see this incredible fruit of people that would never be in those spaces before. We get to be there. And I think, but you ultimately have to want that, and you have to make that a priority. And so if what you want is someone who's just going to come in, rainbow flags everywhere, and if you dare agree on any level, you need to get out. And I think we want spaces like that. I think it's really important to have those spaces, but I don't think those spaces change people's minds. Now, because I want to be clear, I don't think changing people's minds is the most important thing. I think protection of vulnerable people is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we have churches like that in Toronto. But for those people who want to say, actually, I do want to be in a space where we can have this kind of conversation, but it's also recognizing that this conversation is so much more costly for the queer community than it is for us, right? Like, I'm having a theological debate. They're debating whether they are allowed to exist or not. These are not equal weights, and I need to remind people of that as well. So again, I never want to say like, oh, both sides or anything, because I know there is a side. I just want to, I want to bring people to that side, whereas other folks are like, we can't do that. We don't have the bandwidth. And I want to honor that and go, of course you can't, and nor should you.
So I think we'll move on for now to talk about our Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Yes, it has its own jingle, yeah.
You guys are so professional, eh?
We're not that professional. I mean, that was literally Lou, one of our co-hosts, just decided to sing Saint of the Week randomly in an episode, and I just took all of the instances of them singing Saint of the Week and just layered them on top of each other in Audacity, and that's our jingle now. So, our Saint of the Week this week is one of the better known people from a sort of, if you like, proto left wing kind of Christianity. We are talking about Thomas Müntzer, who I'm sort of surprised we haven't had as a Saint of the Week prior to now, but I think it's probably because he is relatively well known in sort of lefty Christian circles. All five of us know who he is. So Thomas Müntzer was born around 1489 in Stolberg, which was then in the Holy Roman Empire, and he died in 1525. This is around the time that the Reformation is happening, right? So a contemporary of Thomas Müntzer is obviously Martin Luther. And when we talk about reform, what that means is that we want things to change. What it doesn't mean is that we want a fundamental shift in the center of power. So the difference between Martin Luther and Thomas Müntzer is that Martin Luther didn't really want power to change or the balance of power to change or anything like that. Thomas Müntzer did. Thomas Müntzer was an out-and-out revolutionary. Now, like pretty much all of our Saints of the Week, he's a complicated character.
It's just like every character from the past 2,000 years. You're like, this person is not without their idiosyncrasies, and we want to acknowledge the...
Totally. I mean, like, if someone was doing this about our lives, hundreds of years from now, I mean, not that I'm sure they will, but I'm sure there are things that I believe that in a few hundred years, people are going to be like, he believed this. That was kind of whack, you know? And like, there were things that Thomas Müntzer believed. Like, he believed that Jesus was imminently going to return. And that was kind of what drove a lot of his beliefs, which we've seen from loads of people throughout history. Like, loads of people are like, yeah, Jesus is coming back, so let's have a revolution, or let's, you know, kill a bunch of people or whatever. And that's kind of what happened. Like, Thomas Müntzer, like, was a key figure in the Peasants' Revolt, the Peasants' War, if you like, in 1524, 1525. And that is what led to his death by decapitation, I think. So the thing about Thomas Müntzer was that he was encouraging peasants to go for rich people. You can kind of see this in some of the quotes. So, for example, all things are to be held in common and distribution should be made to each according to his need, right? Like, I mean, that's straight out of the Bible. But he sort of goes on and he says things like the godless rulers are no longer to be called rulers, but tyrants. They are to be exterminated. And there was a lot of this kind of thinking going around at the time of the Reformation, right? Like this, you know, this stuff definitely existed, but this is someone with a little bit of power saying it and, you know, leading a revolt and so on. The poor shall inherit the earth, and you, the mighty and godless, shall be cast down. And I mean, he out and out encouraged peasants to kill rich people. So, yeah, you could sort of see why and how he ended up losing his head. But I find him interesting from a sort of left-wing point of view, because he was doing something that, yes, was driven by his faith, but we would see in a few hundred years' time happening, well, certainly in like Russia, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. But he was doing this hundreds of years before. And let's be honest, at least in terms of, you know, what we've been talking about today, rich people, poor people, they were right. They were right. And so, yeah, complicated figure, as always, but one who I think we can enjoy on some level as people on the left.
Saint of the week.
I wanted to kind of ask, is there either a danger or perhaps a blessing of becoming known only as the church that is fully inclusive of 2S LGBTQIA plus people?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think if 60 years ago, in America at least, if you were a church that was only known for its, you know, hard line on civil rights, I think you'd be okay with it. And 200 years ago, if you were only known for your emancipation, I think you'd be okay with it. If it was 100 years ago and you were known for your inclusion of women and veneration of women, I think you'd be okay with it. People do kind of make that noise like, well, I don't want this to be the only thing that we're known for. But the thing is, too, that I say, then I go, when was the last time I preached on this? And they can't remember. And the answer is, the last time I explicitly gave a sermon on inclusion was 2.5 years ago. Now it comes up from time to time because last week I preached the end of Ephesians 2, which talks about, hey, now there's more people in. The dividing wall of animosity between the two, between the Jew and the Gentile, has been broken down, and now more people are in. And so kind of God's story is always inviting more and more and more people. That's just what God does.
Yeah.
And it was a really small amount. And I think I talked a bit about, I think that we sometimes think that our value comes from our scarcity, but I actually think our value comes from our creator. And so we recognize it's not because there's only a few of us that we're super valuable. It's because we are created by God that we are valuable in their image and likeness, of course. And so it makes sense, of course, that more and more people would be invited in. You know, even early on, no Moabite will be allowed in. And then in the next book, it's like, anyway, so the Moabites are here now. It's hilarious. Like, God's story is always kind of inviting more and more people. And I think trying to help people understand that is that, okay, so like 50 years ago, well, yeah, maybe this, I don't think our denomination ever was, but it was a very common view to not allow mixed race marriages in churches. Why? Because the Bible's really clear about mixed race marriages being a bad thing if you read it in a certain way. I think it's Nehemiah, isn't it? Where it's just like anyone in a mixed race marriage is like, well, you're gone, and we send the children away. And so there's pretty firm language there if you wanted for that kind of thing. But actually, we see the story of people just being brought in more and more and more. And I try to do that and share that and lead people in that way. So I don't think it's the only thing that we are known for. But I do also think, I mean, here's the thing. We have like 70 people or something. So not massive, not tiny. But people come a long way for Wellspring because there's nowhere else on the way. So if all I'm known for is just this place that, kind of progressive evangelical space, then okay, that means at least to say, I don't like thinking of church in this way, but at least we're doing something different. People go past way better churches to get to us because we're small, we don't have any money, right? There's a bunch of churches with tons of resources and everything, but what we do have is our inclusion and celebration of all people, which other places don't. So if that's all you want to be known for, then you'll probably just be known for that. If you want to nail the rainbow flag everywhere you can, and again, I'd encourage you to do so if you want to, then that's all you'll be known for, and good on you, and I think it's good that you exist. But actually, if you do know that a church is affirming or has a sympathetic or inclusion view or whatever, again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but inclusive churches are probably also less likely to be, say, militaristic. They're less likely to be, I certainly hear, the kind of Make America Great Again church kind of thing. That's what people think when they think evangelical. So I don't think that's all we're known for, but it is, it's something of a flag to say we do have a more progressive theology. So a year ago, someone joined our church and they said, like, how inclusive is this space? And I said, really inclusive, queer people on the board, queer people preaching. Like, you can't get more inclusive than that, short of them having my job, which they're welcome to it. But she said, oh no, I meant like women. And I just like laughed because I'm like, oh wait, you think there's a church that like has like queer leadership but doesn't have women? So that's helpful as well.
I think you need to have a chat with a certain group of Anglo-Catholics.
I know. Oh, don't get me started, honestly. Like, ridiculous.
It's that same old thing again, though, that we were talking about, where it's like, oh, I can recognize my own oppression, but as soon as I have to like do some sort of lateral thinking and apply it to other groups, no way, man. Those people are beyond the pale.
If all you care about is your own oppression, then you don't have the heart of Jesus. And I also think this as well, maybe this is something you guys riff on. I think there's lots of people that are like pro every social movement apart from the current one. So that doesn't make you prophetic. That just makes you, that just means you enjoy the status quo, which is the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to bring up Martin Luther King because, what do we know about him? We know that, like, he was hated. Most people did not agree with him, did not like him, but he was sort of tolerated to an extent by the establishment until he started connecting the civil rights movement with the struggle of, working class people.
No warfare but class warfare, baby.
But that's the thing. As soon as he started questioning,
he died like giving a talk to the sanitation workers, right? Who who try to unionize. Like, I think that's correct. Like, if that doesn't tell you something, absolutely. To say he's tolerated, I don't think that's really fair either. Like, I think that he's been whitewashed now, and so So the fact that like Fox News can unironically quote Martin Luther King shows you that they haven't understood anything. But I think there was a lot of pushback that only amplified as he then connected. And it's the same with Fred Hampton. For people that don't know who that is, he was I think he was about 21 when they killed him, but he was a young black guy in Chicago who connected not only with the African-American community, but also with the some of the South American communities there, and just like the poor white working class, and gathered them together so that they actually like had a voice and everything. And Fred Hampton is an amazing figure from history. You should look it up. Jesus and the Black Messiah is absolutely a movie worth watching as well, that chronicles his life. But the real danger comes in when oppressed groups get together, right? That's when it's difficult to control. And I think Fred Hampton is a perfect example of that. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, they shot him in his bed, I think, didn't they?
Yep. Yeah, it's a night rage. Yeah.
But I mean, that was the thing of the Black Panther Party was seen as so dangerous because they were doing things like free breakfast programs, right?
Yeah. Free breakfast, free schools. Yeah.
Because as soon as you start connecting those movements together and realizing that, I might be focused more on, say, climate change or whatever, you might be focused more on, LGBTQ plus inclusion. But the moment we start connecting those things is when we start becoming dangerous, right? Yeah. Because it's it's like the body of Christ, right? Because we all have different parts to play in a broader thing. And they're not going to like that when we start realizing that.
I think it's also just really important to kind of educate people on power and the power
Mm-hmm.
that they have, whether they kind of recognize it or not, understanding privilege, whether they recognize it or not. And again, we got to do our best to like stop being smug about things. And it's really tempting to be smug. And I really like being smug because obviously I think I'm right about everything.
I feel very called out here, to be honest.
I mean, like, maybe this isn't the podcast for you if you don't like being told that you shouldn't be smug. But again, my interest is in changing people's minds ultimately. And my interest is in showing people beauty that they are drawn to. And what is it that we can do in order to do that? I think that's really important. And I will say also, I think that we do need the prophets out there that just shout and scream and show us and tell us the way that things should be. One of my best friends at church is just this prophetic voice that makes my life way more difficult, but she's right. And we need her there. And as a result, like conversations are happening. And again, I mean, so even right now we're having conversations about, okay, like how do there's a group Christians for a Free Palestine in Toronto who are trying to do some stuff, but haven't found a church to partner with. So I'm working on that, which is again, like in an evangelical space, this is pretty wild.
Yeah.
But of course, like the thing is, because we are known for our progressive, inclusive theology there, people shouldn't be surprised by my kind of pacifist theology elsewhere. Like, well, yeah, because I think violence is wrong against anybody anywhere.
How has the process that the church has been through affected the sort of broader political and economic kind of awareness of the people who are going through that? Because, of course, churches are groups of people, and there's a lot of power in that, a lot of ability to affect change. You know, you've sort of mentioned trying to partner with the sort of pro-Palestinian Christian group. And I wanted to kind of ask more broadly about, you know, whether people have become more kind of aware of other struggles, more politically aware, more economically aware as you've gone through this.
That's a really good question, actually. I don't know. Yeah, you know what? In some cases, absolutely. In some cases, absolutely. And I think the people, especially the folks who I would say probably raised in an evangelical space without even knowing there were other options out there, if that makes sense. So this is the thing that if you've been told that, hey, these things are wrong, or more, the big thing, all evangelicals are told is penal substitutionary atonement, right? So like God had to punish sin and God punished Jesus, so God didn't have to punish you. That is and I've had people say that is the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus took the punishment so that we didn't.
The only problem with that is that it turns God into a monster, right?
I mean, there are 1,000 problems with it, not least the fact that like
there are other problems. I'm saying the main problem with that, you know, I can't worship a God who requires a punishment.
Oh, I say this all the time. Like, if someone came to me and said, "Hey, I'm in a relationship and the guy's really great and I'm really excited. It's all going so well. Such a good guy. Oh, great. Tell me about him." And she said, "You know what? Well, when I do something wrong, he does have to punish me." I'd be like, that doesn't sound like a good relationship. Like that is like, no, but he just needs to.
There are some contexts in which, like, if that's a consenting thing, right? You do you, to be honest, right?
No,
but
that's fine. No. If you like, hey, look, if you're enjoying it, that's fine. No, there's no kink shaming here. But if you don't like it, to say that he doesn't, I would say even within the kink community, to say that someone doesn't have a choice about how they respond is probably not accurate.
Yeah, exactly.
And then if they came back a week later and said, "Oh, good news, he doesn't have to punish me anymore, but he just beats the shit out of his kid anytime I do something wrong," I'd be like, that person should be in jail. That shouldn't be someone you should be in like a relationship with.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big part of it too. I think Brian Zand gives the example of the son, according to penal substitutionary atonement, that is the father sees the son in the distance and his heart is overwhelmed with joy, and he runs to the stable and just beats the shit out of the stable boy, just like beats him and beats him and beats him till he's just a pile of blood and teeth and nothing, and goes, "Finally, I can forgive my son." This is all a long-winded way of saying, I think what it's done is given people permission to recognize there are other ways of reading scripture, other ways of doing things. And and also just encouraging people to read their Bibles a bit more carefully, to say, okay, so yeah, you've got this one verse from Romans 1, there's one verse from 1 Corinthians, and I guess Leviticus, if you really want to go there.
Yeah.
Let's spend a bit of time talking about those things. And my line every time with everyone is, I don't think this thing's in spite of the Bible. I think these things because of the Bible. The scripture is so utterly central to who I am, the way I treat people, the way I understand God. And I think that's been really helpful for people as well. I'm like, okay, let's just like talk about the Bible then. Let's talk about why you think the way that you do. Let's talk about that. And because some of the anti to us LGBTQI plus stuff is so wrapped up with other, let's face it, unkind and cruel politics and theologies, people have kind of drawn away from that. But for some people, it's been hard because they don't have those friends anymore because those friends are voting for Trump, and they're like, what?
And like being, in a sense, ripped from your context by the fact that your opinion is changing and other people's isn't, or maybe theirs is, but it's sort of going the other way. Like that's a really hard process. You do lose friends. You do a lot of friends. You do even lose sort of family members in a sense, especially if you are, if that is the community that you are in and the only community that you are in. I think there are certain places in the US especially where like just everyone is super conservative, that if you end up having a dissenting opinion, I can imagine that being a really, really hard place to be.
It's true. But we also want to honor the fact that I think there's always far more nuance than we realize. Like we think of just, hey, well, Texas is this terrible backward town, and there's lots to criticize about Texas, of course there is. But there's also like millions of people who really disagree with the way that things are done.
I mean, like big cities in Texas are often like really progressive, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Austin, super. But even the rest of the world thinks that everyone voted for Brexit because England voted for Brexit. Just think of it like that, right? Like, well, yeah, England voted for Brexit. It was a vote. So I guess that's how they feel. And I would say that is not representative of certainly me.
And I mean, the really frustrating thing about the whole Brexit thing is that, like, I could imagine myself voting for Brexit if the progressive and left-wing case for Brexit had been made, but it wasn't. Like it was just immigrants. No, get them out. That's what it boiled down to. And I'm never going to side with that.
Yeah, I just like encourage people to, we might think that, like cities are good and boonies are bad and all of these things, and just recognize that in all of these, the number of times I've had this conversation like, well, there were just no gay people where I grew up. I'm like, I promise you there were. You are not a safe place for them. I mean, I went to an all boys school and there were no gay people in my year. I'm like, there were 100% gay people in my year. There were 120 people in my year.
100% of the people in your year were gay, is what you just said. Also, what is this word you keep saying, boonies or something?
Oh, in the boonies, like in the sticks. I don't know, out in the, not in the city, the country folk.
Is that a Canadian term?
Say boonies in England, don't you?
I've never. This is like the time. What was it
we
you
need
said?
A third vote here, I think.
Yeah, I think so. You said something once, though. I remember, like years ago, when you still lived in the UK, and I was like, "What did you just say?" And I think it was just. It sounded like. It wasn't even that it sounded posh to me. It just sounded wrong.
I am very pretentious, so it is a possibility.
Yeah, no. But no, I've honestly never heard that before in my life. The boonies.
The boonies, yeah.
That sounds like an Australian thing. Is your sister rubbing off on you? Is that why?
That's quite possible. It's my sister who lives in Australia. Yeah, we'll let the listeners decide.
It was the most amazing thing that has ever happened, I think, when like I was around yours one day and your sister came back like 6 months after like leaving for Australia and was just fully Australian.
It's
like her accent was just like she's Australian now.
My accent is awful as it is, but she sounds so Australian after like 2 weeks or something. Like, come on. I
was like, I had to stop my jaw in the deck because I was. It's not a bad thing.
Adam, how's it going?
Today, Let's finish with this. A lot of the stuff you've sort of been talking about how we read the Bible and stuff has sort of got me interested in like whether and how you've used liberation theology in this process. You know, for example, have you been using Gospel in Silente Name by Ernesto Cardenal to have some of those conversations, that kind of thing?
So I love liberation theology. It is kind of my jam. Easter time is always the best because you just get to dig out all the liberation theology about. I think what's interesting, and this is, again, I need to be incredibly delicate about what I say here because, again, it's very broad strokes. One of the great sadnesses we're seeing right now is the strong opposition to inclusive theology from a lot of majority world spaces. Now, I'll, of course, argue and say it's a terrible colonized theology that we forced upon them, and now we are seeing the terrible fruit of it. At the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church thing, was it Christian? Anyway, one of the Reformed churches here, it was a very white, very male room, but 3 people of color stood up to give their opposition to an inclusive theology and inclusive ecclesiology, I suppose. And the final one to spoke up was a South American man. And he stood up and said, if you want people like me, you will vote against this inclusive theology, like just straight up. And like, it is racist, like it is racist to accept the gays is basically what's going on. So we want to be like, we want to be so careful. And I think that's one of the things that liberation theology does well, is really acknowledge kind of like the voices of the oppressed and acknowledge the complicated history that comes along with that. That if there's 12 seats at the table and 11 of them go to white men, everyone is fighting for that last one. And so it becomes a real zero-sum game of we force oppressed people and marginalized people to kind of fight amongst themselves, instead of going, blow up like either put more people at the table or blow up the damn table and recognize the table shouldn't be there, nor should the chairs. So all to say, I'm trying to think if I've used like, because I haven't preached on this in so long, I'm trying to think if I've used like kind of explicit liberation theology, but I mean, I use it all the time just because, again, it's a recentering of voices and interpretation of scripture, which I think is necessary. So these things don't necessarily, even if it's not liberation theologians talking about queer identity and queer inclusion, they are talking about a marginalized people, a people without power, and being drawn into the center. So I use them a lot just because it's important to do. Actually, really early on, I think I've been there 1 week, I just did a whole thing on Leonardo Boff's like interpretation of communion and stuff, because I'm just like, so this is kind of my theology on communion, guys. Just so you know where I'm at, and the importance of bringing people to the table and everything. So I guess not explicitly, but more for the fact that I haven't explicitly talked about queer inclusion in a long time. And again, even we mentioned how we're going to the Trans March and you can come along and isn't it great? And we'll see God everywhere. Like I had my friend to the church to the front and said, yeah, where are we going to see Jesus there? And he's like, yeah, like Jesus is in all those places where people aren't welcome. Like we see that over and over again. So it's far more pragmatic, I suppose. Not to say I should read more queer liberation theology, but
I think the reason I bring it up is kind of about that praxis kind of element of it, right? Where like liberation theology is the stuff that happens before it's written down, right? And it happens not by all these big-brained boffins talking about liberation theology. It happens by everyone together, collectively working things out. And I think that's why I bring up Gospel in Silente Name, because it's this process of going through the scriptures without having something imposed on you, right? Chris Howson has been on the pod probably about 4 times at this point, I think. But he was, I went to his church when I lived in the Northeast. And this is what he does in his church, right? Where rather than have a sermon, we will sit down, read the readings for that Sunday, and we will talk about the readings.
It's very Quakery.
There is something quite Quakery about it, although there's definitely more talking, I think, than a Quaker. I was at a Quaker meeting on Sunday, actually, as it happens. But it's about flattening those hierarchies, right? Because like a preach is quite a hierarchical thing. It's quite a paternalistic thing. That's why I bring it up, though, is that it's much more democratizing. And I think works really well in these kinds of processes where it's a gradual shift. It's not something that happens overnight, you know?
Yeah, I would say one of the hilarious things about liberation theology is that liberation theologians themselves will say they're not good at writing because they're just doing the thing. Like, why am I going to write about why I should help the best liberation theologians I know are just the people that are protesting right now. Like, they're not writing books about it because they're just out there, like, with the placards. So there's this kind of inherent bias because the best liberation theologians don't write. That is oversimplification because there are incredible liberation theologians writing, but there is, I think, far more. Let's put it that way. I think there are some wonderful, and they're writing, and that's great. But I think so many excellent liberation theologians are just kind of out there doing things. Yeah. But I think so much of liberation theology as well just kind of even says that people matter and bodies matter and things like that, and kind of stress the importance of divine image and creativity. And so those things don't have to be explicitly inclusive of the queer community, but they just are, because we're saying everybody is creating the image and likeness of God and inherently valuable and beautiful. I think your point about preaching is an interesting one, and I always vacillate because I'm like, I think there is a lot of power there, and so what can you do? Like, so I only speak half the year, the other half the year as members of the congregation. Or, for example, when I did our series on disability theology, none of the members of our community with disabilities wanted to preach. So I brought in some friends from outside. And I also said to them, if you don't want to talk on disability, that's fine. I'll just bring you in later in the year, but I want to give you first refusal on this. And they did, and they were incredible. So we're all better for that. Sometimes we'll just have a conversation on a Sunday morning. Sometimes we'll have like an interview. So it's all those things you can do to kind of recognize there is power here. But if basically anyone that wants it can have it, then there's a lot less involved. It's not.
It's one of the things I'm sort of learning a bit more from, because I've always been a little bit more Marxist in my analysis of power. But I think in recent times, I've become a little bit more appreciative of the kind of postmodern understanding of power being something that's dispersed, you know? Like, yes, power can be concentrated, but actually collectively together we have power. And it's about realizing that and acting on it. And I think that's something that liberation theology does very well, along with sort of the critical pedagogy that liberation theology is sort of grounded in, of like Paulo Freire, people like that.
Pedagogy of the oppressed. And
I think we'll call it a day there, because we've been recording for ages at this point. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anywhere that people can find you?
My socials, I mean, I'm on Instagram, James Sholl, JamesSholl. The church's website is wellspringtoronto.ca, as you do. Is it wellspringtoronto.ca? I'm pretty sure it is.
I can check that.
It is wellspringtoronto.ca. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, I feel like this is a perfect opportunity to use the one other Canadian-related thing on my soundboard. So, here we go.
What's she got for me?
So, what are you in for?
I moved here from Canada, and they think I'm slow, eh?
That is an excellent thing. Yeah, I think we have an Instagram. It's all on our website. I'm usually on a podcast with my friend Danielle Strickland. That's called the Right Side Up Podcast, with Danielle Strickland and usually James Sholl or something. We have to keep on changing the name. So we're doing a series right now on what men need to know from women in churches. We did a series on clergy sexual abuse and the things that we should be aware of and the lessons that we could learn from that.
Which was a great series, by the way. Yeah.
I will say, I mean, it was rough, but it was a really important series that has helped quite a lot of people, which is, I mean, no one listened to it at the time because it was such a bummer, but people have reached out to us and said it's been really helpful. So I'm glad we did that.
Yeah. I really recommend listening to the podcast. I listen to it as well, and it's a great listen. So yeah, go and find The Right Side Up.
So it used to be called the Danielle Strickland Podcast because that's why people were listening to it, because Danielle does quite a lot of speaking around the place and people were like listening to her. And then after the Ravi Zacharias stuff, she's like, I can't just name things after myself. Like, that's a terrible idea. So she changed it to the Boundless Podcast, because that's like her company is called Boundless. and she does a lot of stuff out of the boundless stuff. And then after about a month, we got a takedown from Focus on the Family, who have who have a podcast called Boundless Living or something like that.
You don't want to be associated with that, do you?
So this is the funniest thing. So they were like, we are worried that people may assume that you're in partnership with us, and so we are saying take it down or we'll get your lawyers on you.
It's mutual.
And so, yeah, exactly. So like the first podcast we did after this is like, well, it's now the Right Side Up podcast. We want to state that in perpetuity throughout the universe until the heat death of the sun, we are not associated with Focus on the Family in any way, in any metric. Wow. So that's why it keeps on changing its name, because Focus on the Family tried to sue us.
That is a badge of honor, though.
I know. I mean, that's honestly, I think that's something I'm most proud of in my ministry so far, is getting a takedown from Focus on the Family.
Yeah, I mean, nobody listens to us, so like we haven't had any of that stuff to deal with yet. Like we don't have that kind of badge of honor.
I know, right? Like, yeah, what kind of weight do you have that Focus on the Family are threatened by you? That's Also, if you want to talk about this, just PM me on Instagram or whatever. Like, I love talking about it. I have multiple emails this week from people being like, I want to go to an affirming church, but there's nothing near me. What should I do? And so I get to have those conversations, which I'm really privileged by. So if you want to, james@wellspringtoronto.ca is my email, James Sholl on Instagram. I'm happy to chat if that's helpful for you. And
if you are a UK listener and you can't find an inclusive church in the UK, I'd really recommend going to inclusive-church.org.uk, really good organisation who have a list of churches that have signed up to be included as inclusive churches. And they're inclusive on every way that you can imagine people trying to be inclusive. So, yeah, check that out as well. I'm
pleased to say you can find us on gaychurch.org for the same thing.
Fantastic.
For y'all.
Gay church. That sounds like a great evening, you know.
I'm just proud that they got there first. I'm just impressed they got the domain name.
Yeah. Anyway, so thank you for joining us. You can find me if you want to find me. You can find me at CommieXIA, and with every passing day, I'm beginning to regret that being my handle online.
No way. It's a dope handle. I'm jealous of it.
It's fun, but you can find the podcast at breadandrosaries.com. You can email us at... do you know what? I normally I have this all off the top of my head, but today I haven't got it. Look, just search Bread and Rosaries. You'll find us. It's easy. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next time.